This is Harry Caruso and John Michael Tamburo of Car Wash Advisory doing a podcast webinar on whether or not it makes sense to sell in today's market and the factors to consider in doing so. Hi, John Michael.
How's it going, Harry?
Oh, it's going well. It's going very well.
Good. So where are we going to start today?
Right. So this is a very big topic of discussion, and there's a lot to cover. And obviously, 2023 as a year in the car wash M&A space has been tremendously tumultuous, to say the least.
Definitely.
So I think maybe it makes most sense for our listeners if you would kick off by kind of going over what we've seen over the last year.
Yeah, it's been wild, and I don't think it's certainly not industry specific, right? I think everyone knows M&A as a whole is down this year for a multitude of reasons, but I think what we've seen specifically is, a lot of these guys that came in hot and heavy and have been going at it for the last 2 years with throwing money at problems and trying to get to this, big audacious goal of as many sites as possible, as fast as possible, have realized that that's not the right way to grow a business, right? It's focus on, quantity over quality doesn't usually get you to where you need to be, right? So I think a lot of these guys really set the tone at the beginning of the year, and they've taken a step back and said, well, hey, let's take a look at what we got. And, we can't keep going down this runway before making sure that we have our ducks in a row here. And I think that's really set the tone early on because, it's not like we started the year off with some mega acquisition that really set the tone. It's just been, it chugged along. I think the first that I can recall of any, scalable size was Magnolia.
Right.
And aside from them, nobody's really came in and dropped the hammer this year and said, this is our path forward. This is what we're doing. And I think we're at a point that it's almost like, everyone's thrown it into neutral and is kind of looking left, looking right, saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? And nobody's really pulled ahead, right? Or given at least an indication of where they're going. So I think that's made it tough because in every industry, you're always looking to the leaders, right? To show us where we're going and the path forward. And I don't think anyone's done that, right?
No. And you bring up a good point, which is interest rates. So I think it's worth noting and talking about interest rates may have been the impetus or the cause of sort of this temporal pause and look around, which so many people are doing. But is it really preventing institutional investor profitability in this industry? No. Right?
Yeah.
A 500 basis point hike in interest rates, albeit that of a system shock for many, it's not going to prohibit profitability from a institution's standpoint.
No.
Not with the margins this industry provides.
No, I think it's an easy cop-out, right?
It is, and I think that sort of inherent reticence to invest when others aren't has been seen in a way of groupthink that time has shown us time and time again that it happens in this world, right? So I do agree, and I think that mega transactions are happening more so by necessity, as you mentioned, than they are opportunistically, and that is sort of the theme that we've seen throughout.
Yeah, for sure, right? And even taking a step away because it's, I'm sure it's a lot. I like to categorize these, right? Because what the big guys are doing is much different than what Joe with one site or Tim with 3 sites is doing, right? And it's sort of, in the context of everybody's world, how does this implicate them, right? What does it mean for them and for their market? And I think it's really interesting because it's easy to sit here and say, oh, it's the same, but it's not the same.
No.
Right? And I think, interest rates probably have a much bigger impact on the little guys as opposed to these big guys, right? So the fact that they're using it as almost a cop-out, I think that's really what's adding to the scare, right? Is because we'd expect it, from the smaller size players, but to have everyone just throw their hands up there and say, oof, that's expensive, right? We knew it was coming, right?
Yeah.
So,
and John Michael, just to contextualize this for listeners, right? What's really important just to know in terms of the macro sort of industry, volume is down, right?
Yeah.
M&A volume is extremely down in 2023, both on a per transaction site count basis, on a large transaction basis, and a simple transaction basis. So less deals are being done, point blank and period. And a lot of it is due to this proverbial shift into neutral, as you mentioned. And it comes at the cost of both great operations that do want to sell and we're thinking of selling, as well as those who maybe got in on a bit more of a speculative basis to start.
For sure. And that's why I think it's important. I always, kind of like to ground things a bit because most likely, I think the people that are really impacted, like I said, is the smaller guys, right? So if I am Joe with one site, and I'm coming at it, how has what's happened this year affected me, right? What's the biggest thing that I'm fighting against here? Because it certainly is, it's not a tailwind anymore, right? It's a headwind, and we're going into it, and it's, how do we set ourselves up to move forward? Or is there even a reason to move forward at this point, right? And I think it's very circumstantial, and it's important to understand. So I don't know, maybe we can start with the little guys, right?
Start with the little guys.
Single, let's say what, one to three sites we could bucket. So I'm an owner, I've got 1 to 3 sites. I'm saying, hey, I'm seeing what's going on. There's not a lot of deal activity. I'm in a market. Maybe it's crowded, maybe it's not crowded. It's sort of irrelevant, but I'm at least considering selling or doing a transaction, or maybe getting some growth capital, right? Maybe I don't want to sell. Maybe I want to make a play, right? Because I see the opportunity and I see where things are trending, right? So let's draw a circle to there. What do I do?
What do you do? And I think, so, 2 things I want to make sure that we talk about for everybody's benefit is current valuation levels in terms of real tangible numbers, right? And I think we can leave that to second. I think the crux of this conversation, which you're alluding to right now, is when should you sell or consider selling? And I know that you know this as well as everybody at Car Wash Advisory, is we have one simple rule, and it makes sense to sell when it makes sense for you to sell. And that's the key, right? Yeah. So there are times when offers are too good to not take. Certainly that has happened in many instances over the last 3 years. Yeah. Now, less so than ever before. But now, as we currently stand here, that golden rule of it being an individualized decision for each and every owner is more so true than ever before.
Certainly. And that's why it's important to understand, right? If, I don't want people to have the illusion sitting at home that they're, oh, there's this big opportunity, right? They're happening. They certainly happen. I mean, gosh, we see stuff week over week, kind of come out of nowhere, right? But it's certainly not like it used to be, right? So there are, to your point, there are circumstances where I think it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, this happened. What do you guys think? Is this an opportunity? And I think there are times where it makes sense. But I think the large majority is what people have to understand is, there's not 3, 4, or 5 people lining up to overpay, so to speak, anymore, right? That opportunity is what's really shriveled up. And again, if it's going to happen, I think it's going to happen. But if you're under the illusion that there's 3 people lining up, there's more like 1 or 2, right? And I think that's the difference. And again, it doesn't, not to say it's not going to happen, but, there's a lot of talk, as we know, in the space. And, everybody likes to, give everyone the idea, multiples always get padded up 1, 2, 3, 4. And, I guess we have the privilege of seeing the numbers, seeing the data. And that's something that, at least for me, if I'm making a decision, I want to know what's real, right? I don't want to know what Joe told me, because what's in the game for him to tell me what he actually sold it for, right? Everybody wants to make it seem like they got this big transaction. And the reality is, and we've seen it firsthand, is that, the multiples that are talked versus transacted. I mean, gosh, if I had $1 every time someone told me they got double-digit multiples versus, people that actually got real multiples, like it's just the reality.
But let's talk about that for a second. So let's just hone in on that. So I think, as a owner in this industry, right, everybody likes to be sort of in the flow, right? Yeah. And the grapevine, the game of proverbial telephone being paid by owner operators and intermediaries such as ourselves can be a very dangerous game if played by ill-equipped parties, and when the innate game of telephone causes compounding errors in these sort of narratives. So, I mean, John Michael's alluding to this, and we see this constantly. There are instances where 2 weeks ago, we had an individual who was absolutely an owner-operator, super guy, just like most people in this industry, guys and gals, has experience in the space, and he was 100% convinced that a site of car washes or a package of sites sold for $250 million.
Yep.
That package not only didn't sell for 250, but sold for nearly 75.
Yeah.
But yet, once again, he was 100% convinced of this, and it's not of his fault.
No, right? It's just I guess that's the fun of private markets, right? Is that it's up to those who study and manipulate and share them, right? And it's not to say that he was intentionally misled, but it's just how it is. You add an extra 1 here, an extra multiple here. I mean, it can get carried away pretty fast, and I think it's just a case of broken telephone, right? And that's where, at least for us, I think an overwhelming number of people that are in these 1 to 3 site categories, they come to us and they're under the illusion that they can play and trade with what these 50 plus site guys are doing, right?
Or what they say they're doing.
Or what they say they're doing.
And I think on that note, right, one of the biggest sort of red herrings that one can look for in terms of a red flag of, hey, maybe these numbers aren't exactly what they may seem, or maybe they've been misconstrued as pipeline sites.
Yeah.
So 9 out of 10 times, right, when we're seeing M&A transactions and activity that include a significant portion of either pre-built or soon to open pipeline development sites, there is no consensus nor consistency as to how people industry wide are referring to purchase price multiples, no matter the cash flow metric in relation to these. There just isn't, right? So
well, that's really where you throw your hands up in the air, and I think that's also a large reason why there's this large discrepancy of what actually transacts for what's being said, because I don't think people are fundamentally wrong. I think it's just a matter of misattribution, right? And I think you could look at it, depending how you look at it, you could slice the pie a ton of different ways, right? And I think that's where, again, for someone that's not used to dealing with all the complexity and the nature of those type of transactions, I think it's very easy to look at numbers at face value and say, oh wow, well if they got this, I can get this, and there's always more to it, right?
Always. And for our listeners, hopefully they'll let us know if they want more. I know that this is a video and an audio type of format, but let's at least walk through just a generalized example to put some tangibility around this. And our listeners, let us know if you want something in writing and visible and more visual by nature. But just to demonstrate this point and just how dangerous this game is when it's played as it normally goes. If you have a car wash owner with 10 sites and 10 new developments being built, and they get bought for $200 million, are they being bought for 10 or $20 million a site?
Yeah.
Or, right?
Or what?
Or what?
Right.
And then if they're 10 are cash flowing, right, and the 10 in the pipeline, needless to say, aren't, well, but certainly there's some level of value attribution, whether it be, and we'll do another sort of media outlet for this in terms of the cost plus approach, but certainly, needless to say, there has to be some value attribution to those pre-cash flowing sites, John Michael. There has to be.
Well, definitely, and it's also, as you know, I mean, it's easy to talk about cash flow multiples, but I mean, just think about it. Even if you dissect it to bare roots, right? It's how do you get to these valuations? Well, they're taking their EBITDA, right, which is earnings before interest, tax, and depreciation, amortization. And they're saying, let's multiply that by some industry standard multiple, right? So even if you take 10 for simple math, if a site's cash flowing $1.5 million at 10 times, I mean, that's $15 million for one car wash, right? So who's to say one of those car washes doesn't fit that bucket? But what happened to the sites that are cash flowing $500,000, right? Maybe they just opened. Maybe they haven't had proper attention over the first 2 years, right? Well, if those car washes, even in isolation, are being purchased for 20 times for the same price because it's all blended into the package, are they getting 20 times for a site, or what are they really getting? And that's where I think people look at the numbers on face value and they can get very led astray, right? Because I mean, we've seen sites transact for single sites transact for over 20 times. Why? Not because of the cash flow, right? But because of, there is, again, fundamental value there, right? You've got real estate, you've got assets, you've got equipment, right? You've got all this improvement value. You've got maybe some type of infrastructure, right? That's in there. And again, it depends what you're buying, right? It's not always just about the numbers and a multiple. It's a very naive way to look at it, but it's also the easiest way for people of different education levels and experience levels to be able to communicate together, right?
Yeah, and in many ways, right, the entire exercise of financial multiple normalcy, right, and any sort of normalization in this industry or any industry when we're looking at transactions and deals, the whole goal, right, is to get a apples to apples comparison. Yeah. And that becomes tremendously difficult when the numerator is a moving number and the denominator, and then there's miscommunication in between that. For sure. So let's talk a bit about hard numbers and multiples, and you alluded before to the 1 to 3 site, let's say express exterior owner out there who was hearing in the rumor mill 12 times, 15 times cash flow on an enterprise value basis. What do you say to them today, John Michael?
If they've seen an offer, I'd like to see the offer. If they think they can get it, again, I might be missing something, but it's tough, and I don't want to sit here and have a pessimistic view and say that never happens, because I mean, I've seen it happen. I've been part of that. But I think the reality is that, could you make a case our car wash is worth double-digit multiples? Is any business worth double-digit multiples? I don't know, right? I think there's a, you know, again, not to go down a rabbit hole, but I think you have to sit there and just look at it at very, very simple roots. And, you know, if I was selling this to another individual, you know, even if you strip away all the premiums and this or that, it's, you know, if Joe's trying to sell his single site car wash and he's trying to sell it to, you know, maybe I'm an individual that said, you know what, I'm fed up with my 9 to 5, I've got a bit of money and I want to do something different, right? I love the space, I've been reading a lot of news, it sounds really interesting, let's do it. Well, that's great, right? And that's a very good buyer, right? But the reality is can that buyer get to those type of multiples, 12, 15 times? And one might say, well, yeah, if he really wants the site, I mean, he can pay me whatever he wants to pay me. But again, drawing full circle here, going back to interest rates, I mean, debt is the biggest and a very real constraint. So could someone pay 15 times? Yeah, maybe if they have $10 to $12 million cash sitting in their bank account.
How often does that happen, John?
Oh, and that's the thing is, right? That's like the less than 1% probability, right? So is it fair to sit here and tell people to stake their livelihood and you know, their retirement and, you know, inheritance to their kids on a 1%? No, I would never advise against that, right?
No.
So it's, again, can it happen? Absolutely, but I think it's more important to really understand the buyer profile and figure out, you know, who can come to the table and pay me that number, right?
Yeah.
But I think if we're taking a stance of if you were to sell now and you go to market, is that what I can get? Well, I would say no, because the vast majority of the buyers cannot get there.
No, and that's
Right?
circumstantial to a lot of exogenous factors that
Right.
are all at play here against them. So for these 1 to 3 site operators, before we get on to the bigger guys, John Michael, when does it make sense to sell? And is it possible that it is today?
I think it is. I think, as you mentioned, it's very circumstantial, right? Is it, you know, I think the best place to be in is out of a want to sell, not out of a need to sell, right? If people come to me and they say, I really need to sell, is today the right time to sell? Well, yeah, you need to, right? I don't think there's much decision there, but assuming you have a decision, you know, I think my stance is always get a line in the sand, because at least you know where you stand, right? I can't tell you where markets are going. I can't tell you how fast they're going to continue either to decline or to increase or turn around. I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball and I could sit here and say this is where it's going, but I would feel much more comfortable saying, hey, this is where you are, right? If this is where you are and this is your goals, can we get there, right? And I think if the answer is yes, we can get there, I think obviously to me that's the ultimate decision point is it time to sell, right?
Yeah, I think it's a life decision.
Definitely.
For 1 to 3 site owners, your life takes priority over everything else. If you have kids in college, if you have parents with medical issues, if you have some sort of exogenous circumstance that is zapping up physical and mental energy to the point where you no longer feel
Yeah.
like you're improving your wash on a daily basis,
Yeah.
yes, it's worth considering selling. And that
For sure.
considering is the first and the by far the most important part. And we recommend to everybody that we speak to. We're actually, funny enough, launching a service about this next week in terms of making sure that we provide all the information and all the help possible for owners considering to sell, maybe not now, but in a couple years, to set them up to sell. Right.
sure.
So it's never too early to look at it, but you have to come in with unbiased sort of frame of mind and figure out what true value is, and life circumstances where no matter what in high or low markets always trump any sort of multiple sort of ups and downs that we may see.
Definitely. And that's why I think coming into the process with the understanding of why it makes sense to sell, I think that's going to leave you better off, right? If you come into this under the illusion that, yeah, I'm going to sell if I can get this multiple, right? Whether it's a 5 times or 15 times, I don't think that's the reason, right? And I don't think I'd feel comfortable advising someone to sell because I don't think they've thought it through at that point, right?
No, and one thing we do, John Michael, and you know this, so when owners come to us thinking of selling, we very vehemently ask that they do not share any sort of value expectations. And I would advise, whether you're working with us or whether you're thinking of working with somebody else or working with somebody else, I think that is an absolutely crucial step of the process, is to come in with an unbiased, clean slate. And please, we don't want to be influenced in the way of knowing what you think you need, want, or can get. We are here, any good advisor worth their weight is here to provide true, unbiased facts, opinion, and advice. And you can't do that when you come in with a loaded deck.
No. If you came to me and said I need $5 million, that's all I'm going to fixate on. And as you know, as good as I am at trying to be unbiased and going through everything, how do you get around that, right? I think that's why, again, it's important to come into it, I think, with the right motivation, the right background, the right context, and I think obviously providing any sort of information that's material to do an appropriate valuation. I think having a phone call and being told a valuation, in a 5-minute conversation, I think that's ill-advised. I think it needs to be done methodical, appropriately. And I think that, the one card that I would advise anyone to keep close to their chest is what they need for this to work, right? Because I think that's the only way you can make an unbiased decision and know that you're actually getting the right advice. Because, quite frankly, I would rather come into it and tell a client his wash is worth $2 million less than what he wants for it, but I'd rather have it up front, and I'd rather him know that, hey, I'm telling you this because it's true, not because I want your business, right? And, I can sleep a lot better at night knowing that even if someone decides to go elsewhere or try to sell it themselves, we've done the work, right? We know the probability of it selling for that price. And I think, again, if you want to bet those 1%, by all means, right? Like we've seen it done. And I think it's just, again, making appropriate decisions and making sure that you're providing people with the right information to be able to come to that decision.
Yeah, and John Michael, we touched on this, right? Which is very important, the life circumstances aspect, right? Your business aspiration, your familial goals, everything that goes on in your life, in real life, if you will, right? And I think it's very easy for us to sit here and say, oh, well, you may have a singular circumstance that makes it so it's worth selling today, or you need to sell today.
Right.
But we all know this as human beings. It's never black and white.
No.
Right? So very often we have ourselves being pulled in so many directions that it's near impossible to be able to say, this is the one thing that's going to make it so I have to sell today, or it's a gradient, right? And so much is put on everybody every day. Right. So in those circumstances, I think what's best said is that you should at least, and you cannot have the true self-conversation of whether or not you should consider selling until you know what that variable of what is it worth and what can you get is being had.
Definitely.
And I think one thing that we are afforded in today's market, although one would say it's more tumultuous and a bit more volatile, or even, I suppose you could say stagnant in some regards if you want to look at it from a local minimum perspective rather than more of a macro, is the value going to go up over time? And I think we're afforded with this luxury today as we currently stand in the interest rate market that we're in the car wash market we're in by way of industry consolidation, where we can say, multiples are going one direction, and they're going one direction for most surely the next 3 years, and most likely at least the next 5. And that is not up.
Agreed. It's not up. And I know, I guess before we get into there, I know there's people probably sitting around saying, well, if there's circumstances I should sell, one of them surely has to be with all this crazy competition, right? If I've got someone building across the street, Harry, if there's competition, is competition a good reason to sell? Because I'll share my opinion, but I'd like to hear yours, I guess.
I don't think, so to me, competition is the same thing as a sort of variable of uncontrollability that if it will maybe tip the scales, but it'll never be the fundamental reason to sell. If you love what you're doing, if you love the business and team and company you've built, I mean, for goodness sakes, right? The better operator will always win out in the end, in the long term. It may not be pleasant in the interim, that I will grant you, but that in and of itself is not reason enough to sell.
Agreed. Yeah, I think just to echo what you said, I mean, how many people have we seen come forward and they've said, hey, this big strategic A has built, within either across the street, maybe at a better lot in a corner. And there's been more often than not, I think I can say comfortably, where we've seen initial dips, kind of a slow recovery back to normal. And at some point, volumes are actually higher than they were before.
Oh, very often.
And it's I think the initial knee-jerk reaction is, oh no, this is coming, I should sell. Not necessarily, because, we've seen it before. I mean, when you're managing one site and it's your bread and butter and you live in the community and you know everyone in the community, I think you can do a better job than any of these strategics, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you told me, hey, John Michael, I need you to go manage one site, and then a week later you said, now I need you to go manage 10 sites, I mean, it doesn't matter how good I am. Does it translate? Maybe, but it's not apples to apples, right? Just because you can run one site incredibly well does not mean you can run 10, 20, 30, 50, right? So I think it really comes down to making sure, like you said, right? If you run a good business and you're a good operator, I think that'll win. And I don't think that's a reason to sell. And I know that's a lot of the calls we get is that. And, the answer we always tell people is no, you don't, I'd say, tell me why you think you should sell, right? Prove it to me, right? And a lot of times there is no proof. And, I can't comfortably sit there and say, yeah, you should sell because, competitor A is opening up across the street. It doesn't make sense a lot of the time. So again, it's back to the whole circumstance. I think that's the theme here, right? Is really making sure that you're doing it for the right reasons.
Exactly. Absolutely. And in doing that, right? So this is something that John Michael and I do quite frequently, which we found to be tremendously valuable. And we've heard from those who we've done it for to be the same is you have to have a plan, right? So let's say you are thinking about selling today. And let's say that the way current market conditions are, and let's say given your wash's numbers and performance, selling today would put you in a position where you would be required to, let's say, go get another job in 20 years, right? So that early retirement isn't really early retirement if you're going to go re-enter the workforce.
Yeah.
And the answer to that's no, but the plan that you have to have is being able to look at this and say, here are what my operations and washes are worth today. If I do not change anything else, status quo, as they currently sit with continued operations at their current level, what are they worth in a year, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years? And I will go back to, I think right now, given market circumstances, interest rates, and where we are in the consolidation cycle of the car wash industry as a whole, we are afforded more clarity on the next 1, 3, and 5 years than ever before in the last decade of this industry.
Well, because it's not as unpredictable as it was, right?
No.
Nobody could have predicted the highs would have got as high as they got.
And we never knew when it was going to stop.
No, and I think a lot of people made probably some very poor decisions, because again, it's always awesome, when you're rising to the top, but if you don't know when the top is, you can't prepare for it. And I think now, knowing what we know and knowing where we're heading, like you said, in the next 3 to 5 years, it's relatively easier because at least we can make informed decisions.
Yes,
well, absolutely.
We've top ticked, and
right?
in a pre-revenue company, right, in the venture space, large outside of car washes, right? It's worth infinite. You don't know what caps those sales.
No.
But when you do hit that crest, all of a sudden that sort of wonderful question of, well, where does it peak out? We know what the global max is now, and it's not going back there. And the reason is, John Michael, you tell me if you feel differently, but the bottom line here is interest rates, no matter if they go down tomorrow and how much they go down, it does not matter, along with the number of companies that are at a financial point of inflection and stress by way of capital structure, combined with the number of new builds and the number of in-development sites, results in a macro car wash industry outlook that will not allow for multiples to go back to those crazy levels that we saw in mid-22 in the next 5 years, period. It is impossible. There is just no way. There's too much supply, the interest rates are burdensome, and there's no universe where that can happen.
Yeah, I think the simple way is obviously that is the, I guess, textbook technical definition of what's going on. But in very, I guess, layman terms is imagine this. Imagine you own a car wash and you're now in a scenario where there's 30 others in the market when there used to be 5, right? On top of that, there's a ton of what they call green fields, dirt, that could be approved for car washes. They might not be approved for car washes. And of those 30 people that are now in the market, 10 to 15 of them are multinational across the country that are levered to high heaven to the point where, that's what they're doing. They're figuring out what's next, right? So, all else equal, we have a client of ours and I think he probably put it best. And, when you have a car wash, even if it goes bankrupt, it's still a car wash. Right. So what happens to these, again, drawing full circle back to the example, if we used to have 5 sites in this market and we're now at 30, even if those 5 win and you're the better operator and you say, yeah, we did it. We beat these guys. Well, guess what? There's still 25 other car washes in the market that, again, we talk about this all the time, you and I. Well, what do you do with them? It's a car wash. So whether or not it's good, whether or not it's bad, it's a bad look for the industry as a whole, really. Right?
Yeah, and the jury's out on exactly what's going to happen to those overbuilt sites, and it's on a micro basis, which we talk about a lot, and we're going to do an entire episode on this, which is the overbuilding, what is true saturation, how to properly measure it. Without getting into it, there's a lot to delve into there. Yeah. But bringing it back to selling today, and given the macro environment that we're faced with, I think more so than ever, John Michael, you have to consider selling when you think it may make sense, and you have to make that decision based upon whether or not it does make sense for you.
Yeah.
And it's an individualized decision. This isn't a trade. This is your life. This is everything you've built. This is your team. This is your people. This is your culture. This is everything.
Yeah.
And that decision is not whether or not I can, trade an extra 50 basis points here. Like these are huge decisions that have to be considered, and it's never too early to consider them.
Yeah.
But the answer very well may be no, and don't plan to sell for another 10 years. Without having an honest and earnest conversation and looking through everything, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah.
And you don't need to have that anxiety build up over time.
Yeah, and as you know, I mean, getting an extra $1 million that you need to pay cap gains on
I don't
today.
know what that looks like.
Well, that's right. But that's the thing is to get that money, to say you got a 12 times multiple, and to be able to tell all your friends that you sold your wash for more than them, to have to go get a job at 65 because, it wasn't the right decision for you. I mean, that sucks, right? And that's a lesson that a lot of people are going to learn when it's too late.
So in summary, John Michael, I think where we're at is, one, it's an individualized decision, and that's your golden rule.
Always.
And two, it's never too early to start considering it. And as I mentioned earlier during this, and I think we should do a better job in terms of communicating with our entire audience base as well as the industry as a whole, is there are a lot of things that if you come to us to sell and you need to sell today, well, goodness me, I wish we had a conversation 2 years ago so that you could put into place all the variables that would make it so that your sale is going to be for that much higher of a price and that much more liquidity in terms of having multiple offers and conclusiveness by way of transacting, right?
For sure. Well, and I think too that gives a good example. A lot of people, at least for us, we reach out to people, we have people reach out to us, and we always, when we have these conversations, a vast majority, as there's a fixed percentage that sell every year, but there's also a much larger percentage that it's not the right time for them, right? And does it mean you shouldn't be having these conversations? Does it mean that it's detrimental for you to hop on the phone with anyone, whether it's us or someone else, and say, hey, what do you think, right? I think I would encourage everyone, number one, talk to everyone as much as possible, right? You want to get as much information from as many sources because then you can figure out, where's the true north, right? So I think, there's that, but also, at the same time, I mentioned that line in the sand, right? And to me, getting a valuation is that line in the sand of where we are, but also, it might be really bad, right? That valuation, you might get to a point where you say, holy crap, that's half of what I was expecting. And, obviously people get very frustrated and upset, and it's a very hard conversation sometimes for us to have with people. But I think it's, at least me personally, I would rather have that conversation knowing that, hey, I have time to do something about it than before it's too late, right? And I think that's where making sure that either, get a valuation early, and if the valuation doesn't go where you want, or it doesn't give you warm and fuzzy feelings that you're on the right track, I think step 2 to that is, well, what do I do about it, right? And I think that's where, I know you mentioned earlier for us, and maybe you can dive a little bit into it, but I think having the steps and having the plan early on is important, right? And I think that's, we're at the point now where we do this for so many people. And we've been asked this so many times of, well, what do I do? Or, what can I do to get more money? And I think that to me is the second step. It's getting a valuation is great, but for me to sit there and tell you all the things that's wrong with your site and the things that are good with the site, it doesn't really help you, right? So what do these people need to be? What would be helpful, right? If you were in that situation, what would make it more helpful for you at that point?
Well, an action plan, right? And it's not dissimilar to personal medical health, right? So there are some people who avoid the doctor like the plague.
Yep.
Right? I'm not going to get my annual physical.
I won't touch that.
I don't want to know how messed up I am. I don't want to know how many things are broken. Leave me alone. I'm riding this wave.
You're fine.
Obviously. And if even for those out there that are that way, and I definitely am not one myself.
Won't touch
for
it.
those, think about it in terms of your loved ones. Obviously, you want them to have regular and routine checkups. So what you alluded to, Jam, which was that of, okay, great, the valuation isn't where we want it, would be akin to that of getting a diagnosis with no prognosis from a doctor. So congratulations, you have colon cancer, and we don't know what to do.
We'll see you in a couple of years, right?
Like, good luck. See you later. I think what that key is, yes, it is a terrible sort of conversation to have, and a learning of, hey, I have a potentially terminal disease or illness. But in knowing so, the prognosis to come thereof can solve the problem, but you certainly can't do that without the diagnosis. So it's that prognosis of knowing what that action plan is to get to a valuation that does work,
Yeah.
that is ultimately beneficial.
Absolutely, right? And it's things as simple as, again, breaking it down to its very simplest roots, right? If we want to use these industry trading multiples, right? Well, how do I get a higher price? Well, if multiples are going down, it's an equation, right? So if one number is going down, well, what do we have to do with the other number to offset that, right? Or minimize it, right? And it's very simple. At least it sounds simple, is you have to raise it, right? And the number that you have control of is your financials, right? And a lot of people get into this and you run your business and you do things, but again, the beauty is that we have such a privilege to work with such great operators in every state across the country that I can tell you this, if I've seen something, that I've never seen before, it probably happens on a daily basis. And then this is literally all we do every day, right? Yeah. So, to think that, well, my business is running well, it's sort of the same thing as, well, hey, I got a good offer, right? Well, how do you know if it's right? You got a good offer if you don't have a benchmark?
Information is useful. Information is power. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is not power without a referential point of sanity.
Exactly.
A checkpoint.
Exactly. Right. And you might think that, hey, my business is running at 50% margins or 40% margins, and that's awesome. But the beauty is that, well, why wouldn't you run that against, thousands of other washes exactly the same as you across the country and see where they're light, where they're heavy, and maybe look at yours, versus theirs and say, wow, if I got better here, here, and here, I could be, closer to this number. Right. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't think it's possible. But again, to your point, it's if you don't have that referential point, how do you know you're doing a good job or how do you know you're doing a bad job, right? Oh. And, who knows, right? We might see someone come in and say, hey, I think my business needs to be better. And it might be the best business we've ever seen. It just happens, right? And it happens frequently. So I think it's important, right? And it's a good place to learn.
It most certainly is. So to summarize all of this, right? The answer to the perennial question of does it make sense to sell? That's an individualized question and answer. Yep. And it's more so important to be treated as an individualized question and answer now than ever before.
Yep.
We would recommend anybody that has any questions, any thoughts, anything of the sorts. We're always here to help. So once again, this is Harry Caruso of Car Wash Advisory and John Michael Timburo of Car Wash Advisory. And we look forward to doing more of these, and let us know what you guys think, what you want to hear, and anything else you want to learn about.
Say the summary one more time, but look at the camera.
The whole summary?
Yeah.
No, it was fine.
No, I just wanted to look at the camera. Anytime you're saying, like if you introduced yourself as John Michael and Harry, that part makes sense to look at the camera.
Okay. So John Michael, in summary for all the listeners out there, whether or not to sell your car washes is a true individualized question and answer. And now more so than ever before, this reigns true. So we would highly recommend anybody considering selling, thinking about selling, make sure to understand that this is not just a broad stroke question and answer. It's individualized to you, and you owe it to yourself to at least explore the peculiarities, unusualities, and the intricacies that apply to you in answering such. So I know that we're going to do a lot more of these, which we're really excited about. If anybody has any thoughts, questions, comments, topics they'd like covered, anything of the sorts, please do let us know, and we will be sure to prioritize doing so and look forward to doing more of these.
Absolutely.